My name is Margaret Hale. I am 72 years old. That morning the house felt heavier than ever. The curtains swayed gently, but even the breeze could not push away the silence. On my lap was a leather folder, edges worn, papers inside stacked neatly after weeks of trembling hands sorting them over and over again. I stared at the folder as if it were a lifeline or a weapon. Outside the thin glass window, voices drifted in, sharp and mocking. Mr. Miller, my neighbor for more than 30 years, was leaning over the fence, speaking loud enough for the whole street to hear. Her, in court. Don't make me laugh, she won't last 10 minutes before fainting. The woman next door chuckled in agreement. Poor thing, too fragile, too old, she should just stay home and let the young ones handle it. I lowered my gaze, letting their words sink into the quiet room. It wasn't the first time I'd heard them. Fragile, weak, invisible. My own children had said it too, though not always to my face. Sometimes in whispers they thought I couldn't hear, sometimes in sighs heavy with impatience. They believed I would crumble under the weight of a courtroom. I pressed my palm against the folder and felt the papers crinkle inside. No one knew how many nights I'd sat alone, reading every line, every date, every signature until my eyes burned. No one saw the hours I spent piecing together the truth that they had buried. The silence they thought would break me had become my shield. And as I sat in that chair, the morning sun spilling across the floor, I whispered to myself, "Let them talk, let them laugh, because when the doors of that courtroom close, it won't be me who breaks." A week before the court date, my son Thomas insisted on hosting a family dinner. He said it was to discuss practical matters, but I knew better. The dining room was lit by a golden chandelier, but the light felt harsh, almost cruel. Around the table sat my children, their spouses, and a few relatives who had long stopped hiding their curiosity. The air was thick with perfume, wine, and something else, expectation. Thomas cleared his throat. He was always the first to speak, always the loudest. "Mother," he began, his tone a performance for the room, "we all know you mean well, but court is no place for you. You can barely stand for long. You'd only embarrass yourself and us." The room chuckled softly. Clarissa, his wife, leaned in with a smile as sharp as broken glass. "He's right, you know. Margaret, sweetheart, you wouldn't even understand half the legal words they throw at you. Why don't you save yourself the stress? Just sign over the papers and let Thomas handle it like a real man of the house." Her words cut deeper than the laughter. I glanced around the table. My daughter Sarah kept her eyes on her plate, pushing peas back and forth with her fork. She didn't defend me, didn't meet my gaze. That silence spoke louder than Thomas's booming voice. One of the relatives, a cousin I hadn't seen in years, snickered. Imagine her trying to out-argue a lawyer. She might faint before she says a sentence. The laughter that followed clinked louder than the wine glasses. I sat there, hands folded on my lap, my leather folder hidden under the table. My heart pounded, but my face remained calm. I let their words fall on me like stones, because they didn't know the truth. They thought their mockery would corner me into surrender. They thought humiliation would make me retreat. But every cruel chuckle, every dismissive word, only carved the determination deeper into my bones. I raised my glass slowly, my hand steady despite their whispers, and said softly, almost too softly, "We'll see whose strength truly matters when we stand before the judge." The laughter died for just a moment, and in that silence, I saw fear flicker, just briefly, in Clarissa's eyes. That night after the humiliating dinner, I sat alone in my kitchen. The laughter of my family still echoed in my ears, but beside me was something louder, the leather folder. I opened it slowly. Contracts, receipts, handwritten letters, fragments of truth scattered through years of neglect. My fingers trembled, but not with weakness, with determination. I knew I couldn't do this alone. So the next morning, I walked to the edge of town to a small house with fading blue shutters. When the door opened, I was greeted by Ruth, my oldest friend. Once she had been a court clerk, sharp as a knife in her younger days. She looked at me with surprise. "Margaret, what are you doing here at this hour?" I held up the folder. "They think I can't fight. Will you help me prove them wrong?" Her eyes softened, then narrowed with fire. She led me inside, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. Night after night, Ruth and I sat at her dining table, piles of papers stacked high. She read aloud, explaining terms I'd never understood. I scribbled notes in shaky handwriting, forcing myself to learn every clause, every number. Sometimes, exhaustion hit so hard that I would doze off with a pen still in my hand. But when I woke, the papers were still there, waiting for me. Ruth wasn't my only ally. Through her, I was introduced to Daniel, a young attorney barely starting his career. He looked at me skeptically at first. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not sure I have the experience for a case this complicated." I placed the folder in his hands. "Then let this be your first true fight, because I don't need someone polished. I need someone who still believes in justice." Daniel flipped through the documents, his brows lifting as he uncovered inconsistencies, forged signatures, bank transfers that didn't add up. His hesitation turned into conviction. "They underestimated you, Mrs. Hale. That was their first mistake." And so the three of us formed an unlikely alliance, a widow, an old court clerk, and a lawyer barely older than my grandchildren. While the world slept, we worked. Lamps burned deep into the night. My frail body ached, but my mind grew sharper. Each document I mastered, each truth I uncovered, was a stone added to the foundation of my strength. By the time the court date drew near, the trembling in my hands wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. For the first time in my life, I was ready to speak. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse stood tall, its stone pillars worn by decades of storms. To most, it was just a building. To me, it felt like an arena, one where strength wasn't measured by muscle, but by truth. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Wooden benches creaked as neighbors, relatives, and strangers leaned in to get a glimpse of the spectacle. I could almost hear the murmurs circle like smoke. "She won't last an hour. Look at her hands already shaking." At the plaintiff's table, I placed my worn folder gently in front of me. Across the aisle, Thomas sat with his head held high, Clarissa whispering into his ear with a smile of smug confidence. Mr. Grant, their attorney, strutted forward with the air of a man certain of victory. He opened the session with a booming voice. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we believe Mrs. Hale is not in a state fit to testify or comprehend the complexities of this case. At her age, frailty and confusion are inevitable. This proceeding itself risks her health." Laughter, low, mocking, rippled through the benches. I caught sight of Mr. Miller in the back row, grinning, nudging his neighbor. Daniel, my young attorney, rose to his feet, his voice not as commanding but steady. "Your Honor, appearances can be deceiving. We ask that Mrs. Hale be allowed to speak for herself in her own time." The judge, Collins, raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He leaned forward slightly. "Proceed." I rose slowly, my knees aching, my hand gripping the table for balance. The room stilled, waiting for me to stumble, to falter, to prove them right. Mr. Grant smirked, arms folded. "Take your time, Mrs. Hale. No one expects much." I looked at him, then at my son, so sure, so certain, and then at the folder before me. With trembling fingers, I opened it, pulling out the first document. The paper shook, but my voice, when it came, carried farther than I expected. "You say I am too fragile, too weak, too confused. Then perhaps you will explain this." I lifted the document high enough for all to see, the inked signatures visible even from the gallery. The courtroom, once humming with ridicule, fell into silence. Because in that moment, the fire had only just begun. The paper trembled in my hands, but not from fear, from power contained within ink and signatures. I stepped forward, placing the first document on the judge's bench. "This," I said, my voice calm but carrying through the hushed courtroom, is the original deed to the property my late husband and I built together. Notice the date, notice the signatures, and notice how the copy my son submitted doesn't match. Gasps rippled across the room. Thomas's face drained of color. Clarissa gripped his arm, whispering frantically. Their lawyer, Mr. Grant, blinked rapidly, flipping through his own stack of papers, suddenly less confident. Your Honor, surely this must be, he stammered, but I wasn't finished. From the folder I pulled another paper, this one a series of bank records, transfers in neat black ink. Here are the accounts, money siphoned without consent, funds moved under names that were not mine. Tell me, Mr. Grant, how a fragile, confused old woman managed to find the trail you and your clients thought was buried. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the evidence. The silence was sharp, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. In the back row, Mr. Miller, the neighbor who once mocked me shifted uncomfortably, no longer smiling. Thomas slammed his palm on the table, his voice shaking. This is ridiculous. She's twisting things. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But even Sarah, my daughter, who had stayed quiet all this time, lifted her head. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, her eyes wide with dawning truth. The room that once whispered about my weakness now held its breath, staring not at a frail old woman, but at a witness, a fighter, a storm waiting to break. I pressed my hand against the stack of documents and said softly but firmly, I may be 72, I may walk slower than I once did, but don't mistake silence for surrender. The truth speaks louder than age, and today it will roar. And in that instant, the courtroom that once laughed at me had nothing left to say. The courtroom, heavy with silence after my revelation, suddenly cracked open like glass under pressure. Thomas shot up from his seat, his face red with rage. This is a trick. Mother doesn't know what she's doing. These papers are forged. He slammed his fist on the table so hard that the sound echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Clarissa grabbed his arm, her voice shrill and panicked. Stop shouting, Thomas, you'll only make it worse. But her own mask of confidence was gone, her painted smile replaced with the pale tremble of fear. Mr. Grant, their attorney, shuffled his papers desperately, sweat forming at his brow. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, tumbling out as broken stammers. The image of calm control he had worn so proudly now hung in tatters. And then Sarah. She rose slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she looked from me to her brother. Thomas, how could you? Her voice cracked. You told us this was all for the family. You told me Mother wouldn't understand. Thomas spun toward her, his rage spilling over. Stay out of this, Sarah. You've always been weak. Weak. She interrupted, tears streaming down her cheeks. The only weak ones here are us for lying, for stealing, for letting her stand alone all these years. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Clarissa sank into her seat, clutching her shawl as if it could hide her. Thomas raged, his voice hoarse, but every outburst only made him look smaller. Their masks of control, of confidence, of superiority were shattering piece by piece. I stood steady, my hands resting lightly on the table, not a word wasted. For once, it wasn't me they were laughing at. It was them, stripped bare in the eyes of the law, their greed unveiled. The gallery that once whispered mockery now stared in wide-eyed silence. Some even shook their heads in disgust at Thomas and Clarissa. And then I said, my voice quiet but clear enough for all to hear, You called me fragile. You called me too weak to stand. But look at yourselves now, breaking apart while I remain whole. The courtroom froze. Their masks were gone, and all that remained was truth. The courtroom had descended into chaos. Thomas shouting, Clarissa trembling, Sarah weeping, the gallery murmuring. Yet above the noise, Judge Collins raised his hand. Bang, the gavel struck wood. The sound cut through the tension like thunder. Silence followed. Judge Collins's eyes swept across the room over Thomas's rage, Clarissa's panic, Sarah's shame, and finally landed on me. He spoke slowly, every word deliberate. I have listened, I have read, and I have seen. In this room, arguments were loud, but truth was louder. Thomas shifted nervously. Clarissa looked down. The judge continued, his voice steady. They said you were too fragile to stand, Mrs. Hale, too weak to fight, but in this chamber today you carried more strength than anyone else. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. The strongest one here is you. The words echoed, filling every corner of the courtroom. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My eyes fell on the folder in front of me, the same worn leather folder they had mocked, the same one that carried nights of tears, fatigue, and resolve. I placed my hand on it, steady now, no tremor in sight. Behind me, the gallery was silent. Even Mr. Miller, who once ridiculed me from behind a fence, lowered his eyes in shame. I stood straighter than I had in years. My knees still ached, my back still bent, but none of that mattered anymore. Strength wasn't in youth or muscle. It was in endurance, in truth, in silence that refuses to break. And in that moment, as the judge's words hung like a crown above me, I knew. They could strip away money, they could betray blood, but they could never again call me weak. The courthouse emptied slowly, footsteps echoing down marble halls. My children slipped away one by one, Thomas storming out with his head low, Clarissa clinging to his arm in silence, her eyes darting away from mine. They had come in with laughter and arrogance, but they left with nothing but shame. Only Sarah stayed behind. She walked beside me as I stepped into the afternoon light. Her hand, warm and trembling, found mine. "I'm sorry, Mother," she whispered. "I should have stood with you sooner." I didn't answer with words. Instead, I squeezed her hand gently, but firmly, letting her know forgiveness wasn't in speeches. It was in presence. That evening, I returned to my quiet home. The air smelled faintly of lilacs from the garden my husband once tended. I carried the leather folder into the living room, placing it carefully on the wooden table by his portrait. For a moment, I sat in silence, the house bathed in the golden glow of sunset. Then I whispered toward the photograph. We won, not with shouts, not with anger, but with truth. Tears stung my eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, I felt lighter, as if the weight I had carried for months had finally lifted. Sarah joined me, sitting close. She rested her head gently on my shoulder. The house that had once been filled with whispers of doubt now felt full again, not of noise, but of peace. I leaned back, closing my eyes, knowing the world would never see me the same way again. Not fragile, not weak, but strong. Strong enough to endure silence, betrayal, and ridicule, and still rise. Strength is not measured by youth or muscle, but by standing tall when everyone expects you to fall. If you've ever been told you're too fragile, remember this. Silence can be a sword, and truth will always have the final word.